Hello and welcome back to Plant Biology here at NICC. This lecture will cover Chapter 32 in the Biology 2E textbook. This is going to be looking at plant reproduction, which is going to be a bit of a continuation of some of the concepts and ideas that we talked about last time from Chapter 26. Again, when we're looking at plants, we're talking about the differences between these haploid gametophyte generations and the diploid sporophyte generations. With the plants that we're going to be talking about today, we're really looking at the sporophyte generation dominant plants, so the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. With sexual reproduction of the angiosperms, we're going to review and look at flower structure, which is something that we've already looked at. So again, we're going to look at figure 32.3 and see these basic structures associated with angiosperm flowers. And so we're going to see the ovary, the stigma, the style, the anthers, the stamens, and things like that. So review those different structures and understand how those different structures are fit together within the flowers of the angiosperm groups. The chapter then moves forward and talks about the male gametophyte, which is the pollen grain. And again, with this alternation of generations, we have these multicellular, one-end structures that we're calling this gametophyte material. And so with these pollen grains, this is really the structure, this independent structure that is sort of moving forward and producing the gametes that fertilize the female flowers. We then move forward and talk about the female gametophyte, the embryo sac. Again, a little more detail. Figure 32.8 in the book is really showing the sort of interior structure of the embryo sac, the polar nuclei, the egg, and things like that. Then moves forward and talks about sexual reproduction in gymnosperms. So again, with the gymnosperms, we have this alternation of generation, with the sporophyte generation being dominant, but we do have these male and female cones that produce these gametophytes for sexual reproduction. We then go on to review sort of sexual reproduction strategies within gymnosperms, where we have the female cones, generally speaking, at the tops of the plant, so that it's a mode of preventing self-pollination. Goes in again talking about the male gametophyte, which we've already talked about, so this is review. Also the female gametophyte, the microsporophyll and the megasporophyll and things like that. Again, just the development of these sexual reproductive structures within the gymnosperm group. Then it moves on and sort of compares some of the differences between the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Really, double fertilization is a big difference within the angiosperm group that we don't see within the gymnosperms. So also there's a lot of variation in sort of mode of fertilization. Within the gymnosperms, it's mostly wind pollination. Angiosperms, as we've already discussed, very diverse forms of pollination within that group. Pollination is sort of the next step along this reproductive pathway, where we have this combination of gametophytes, and pollination is really is defined as a movement of pollen from the anther to the stigma of either the same flower or another flower. Self-pollination is totally possible, and some plants function perfectly well self-pollinating, and some don't. Where we have self-pollinating plants, the pollen from the anther of one plant is deposited to the stigma of the same flower, or another flower on the same plant, which is essentially just mixing genetic material with itself. Cross-pollination is where we move pollination from one flower to a different flower on a different individual of the same species. So we have much more diversity, potential with cross-pollination events than we would with self-pollination. But one of the advantages of self-pollination, if there's no other individuals of your species within your area to be pollinated by, if it's possible to self-pollinate, you can still reproduce. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both of these strategies, and it really depends on what species we're talking about. And so, sometimes organisms have to make the sacrifice of diversity for reproduction. Sometimes they choose diversity over reproduction, and both of those strategies, depending on sort of the evolutionary context that those plants are in, will be more successful or not. That's really just one of those sorts of accidents of evolution that they will work out or they won't, but the constant experimentation that we see within these experimental pathways is always fascinating to look at. Pollination strategies also vary between different plants. Sometimes you'll have the flower structure will prevent cross-pollination in certain ways, but oftentimes, especially with the angiosperms, we see pollination by insects as a very specifically evolved trait within these organisms. And so there's a nectar reward often for organisms to fly to these or move to these flowers and move pollen from one flower to the next. And usually there's a reward for that. Nectar is very common. Sometimes pollen is indeed the food that the organism is looking for. Again, we can have smells of rotting or decaying flesh that are associated with fly and beetle reproduction. Those ones often have flowers that do indeed look like meat. So very interesting strategies have co-evolved with these pollinators to sort of get the job done in very many different ways. The genus Amorphophallus is a great example of an organism that uses this intense fetid smell and coloration. The University of Wisconsin used to have a really great example of it. So they called it the Titanarum. I'm not sure if it's still in their greenhouse or not, but every once in a while it'll flower, and it develops this enormous flower that just stinks to high heaven. And it's really a fantastic example of these really strange reproductive pathways that some plants have taken to co-evolve with other organisms, to pollinate their flowers. Bats also pollinate plants. Agave, guava, morning glories, all entice bats in to pollinate. Birds pollinate. Hummingbirds, of course, are the most sort of typical when you think of pollinating birds, but lots of different sort of strategies to pollinate within, as well as the wind. Wind is a very common pollinator, and it's also very evolutionary successful because it's seen in lots of different contexts. There is some pollination by water in the angiosperm group. It'll be a little different than, say, when we're looking at the bryophytes, where the gametes have to actually swim through the water. In the case of pollination by water, it'd be the movement of the pollen grains via water rather than an actual swimming sort of motion. Chapter then goes on to discuss fertilization, which again, that's where we have sperm cells fusing with the polar nuclei of in the ovary to develop this angiosperm material. Again, that's really to help feed these growing and developing embryos before they become fully autonomous with their photosynthetic properties. Seed develops. The book goes into some detail on seed development, and then the seed germinates when conditions are right. Some seeds require a set period of time, or perhaps a freezing thawing cycle, scarification. Some require fire. There's a lot of different strategies that plants often have to prevent the immediate germination of their seeds, because oftentimes seed production might be at the end of the growing season when conditions may not be optimal for germination. You wouldn't want a brand new seedling to germinate in November and die with the next frost. That would not be efficient use of energy in the eyes of a plant. Chapter then goes on to talk about development of fruit and different fruit types, and it talks in more detail about fruit and seed dispersal. And this is something we've touched on. Again, this is going to go into much more detail about these different strategies that plants have evolved to disperse their seeds in the environment. And these are really strategies for reproductive success. Now, sexual reproduction, very common thing that we see in plants, but also common in plants, is asexual reproduction. Many animals cannot reproduce asexually. Some can, but many can't. And this is a big difference often that we see between plants and animals. You know, if humans cut off their arm, it's not like the arm grows into a new human. So reproduction by humans is entirely sexual reproduction. There is no asexual reproduction pathway in any sort of naturally occurring system that humans have. Plants, however, often have asexual reproduction capabilities, whether that reproduction is coming from the roots or the stems or leaves, depends entirely upon what type of plant we have. Humans can also use asexual reproduction for our own sorts of benefits. We can use processes like grafting, where we cut off branches and stems of one plant and attach them to either the same type of plant or a closely related plant. Grafting for grapes and apples, for example, common practice to get the types of fruit that would be targeted. Stem cuttings, oftentimes willows and things like that, you can cut them and stick the sticks right in the ground and they will reroot and grow. Layering is another method where you can bury a stem underground, and burying that stem, putting it in low light conditions, putting it in contact with the soil, can stimulate that stem then to produce roots and essentially grow a new tree from that stem. There are also sort of, I'll say, laboratory-based propagation techniques, micropropagation or tissue culture, very common as well. This is growing a single plant in laboratory conditions, usually on an agar or a sterile sort of substrate. It'd be different than growing in a greenhouse. But if you're interested in threatened or endangered species or things like that, also if you're interested in very closely monitoring disease conditions, this tissue culture method is super important. Plant lifespans. Some plants live a very short life. Some plants live a very long life. And this really is very dependent on the type of organism that we're talking about. So some bristlecone pine trees, for example, in the book, known to live over 4,500 years. That's an intensely long time to be an organism on this planet. The aging process of a tree is known as senescence, and so it really is a complex biochemical pathway where plants are aging and developing through these different sorts of life cycles and either preparing for seasonal changes or as just part of their dying process. All right. That finishes up chapter 32. I hope you guys had a great Thanksgiving week, and we'll talk at you later.